It's the biggest prisoner swap between Russia and the West since the Cold War, despite the worst hostility in modern times because of the invasion of Ukraine. How was the deal done? Why did it happen now? And could better relations follow? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The exchange of 26 prisoners between Russia, Belarus, and the West had echoes of the Cold War. Planes flying from east and west for a handover rendezvous in Ankara. But nothing quite like this has been seen before, both in scale and complexity. Months of diplomatic negotiations took place amid intense secrecy, a feat in itself, especially in a deal to exchange so many people. Even more so with dozens of officials and agents, as well as the leaders of Russia and the U.S. directly involved. All this while Russia wages war in Ukraine, facing Western and U.S. weapons sanctions in what Moscow says is a proxy war with NATO. So, how was this deal pulled off? How complicated was it? And could it give hope for a thaw in relations between Russia and the West? We'll be discussing all this with our guests shortly, but first, this report from Victoria Gatenby.
Former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan steps onto home soil after nearly 6 years in a Russian prison. Also freed in one of the biggest prisoner exchanges with Russia since the Cold War, Evan Gershkovich, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and Alsu Kumasheva, an editor at Radio Free Europe.
Getting off the plane, seeing the president, the vice president, that was nice. It was a good homecoming. So looking forward to seeing my family down here and just recuperating from 5 years, 7 months, and 5 days of just absolute nonsense by the Russian government.
The three Americans were among 16 prisoners Russia released in exchange for 8 Russians held in the US, Norway, Poland, Germany and Slovenia.
The toughest call on this one for other countries is I asked them to do some things that were against their immediate self-interest, and really very difficult for them to do, particularly Germany and Slovenia. Slovenia came in at the last minute, and I tell you what, the chancellor was incredible.
In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin gave a hero's welcome to the freed detainees, among them assassin Vadim Kozikov, who was released by Germany.
I want to congratulate you all on your return to your motherland, and I want to address those of you who are directly related to military service. I want to thank you for your loyalty to your oath and to your duty.
Kozikov was convicted of murder in 2021 for killing a former Chechen rebel in Berlin. In return, Germany welcomed home 5 of its citizens from Russia.
This is a special moment which surely intensifies the friendship between the US and Germany. It is also a sign of reciprocal readiness to do something out of our common tradition as a nation under rule of law, as democracies and also free societies.
The Biden administration says the exchange is a win for multilateralism and diplomacy. For Putin, it's seen as a diplomatic win, achieved despite a historic low in relations with the West because of its war in Ukraine. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. From Moscow, we're joined by Dmitry Babich, a political analyst for Sputnik International news agency. In Boston is Glenn Carle, a former CIA official and former Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats at the National Intelligence Council. And in Berlin is Stephen Erlanger, the Chief Diplomatic Correspondent for Europe at the New York Times. Thanks so much for joining us today. A warm welcome to you all. We appreciate your time. Stephen, let me start with you today. We've heard U.S. President Joe Biden repeatedly thank Germany and Slovenia and talk about how difficult it was for them to sign on to this swap. Germany, we know, didn't want to release Vadim Kozikov, who had been convicted of murder in 2021 for killing a former Chechen rebel in Berlin. At the end of the day, did getting this all done hinge on Germany and Slovenia? And how did Biden go about convincing them?
Well, I think it did hinge on Germany, especially because Putin had made it very clear, even to Tucker Carlson, that it was Kozikov that he wanted. I mean, Putin, former KGB, continuing perhaps KGB, feels loyalty to his officers. Kozikov though originally Russia denied that he was killing this guy on state orders. Clearly he was, and Putin wanted him back, partly to show loyalty to his officers. He did the same with the people who tried to kill Skripal. I mean, there's a loyalty there. So that, I think, was the key man involved. And of course, Germany has its own laws. Olaf Scholz, I think, did this for Joe Biden. It was a very difficult thing. The original deal would have involved Navalny, which Germany really, really wanted. When Navalny died, whether from natural causes or whether he was actually murdered, I don't think we'll ever know. Germany cooled on this because it wasn't getting enough out of the deal for itself. But in the end, Scholz agreed to go along. He got some German prisoners out of Belarus, and also there were Russian dissidents who were released from prison who came out with Gershkovich. So in the end, I think it was mostly about Germany, though Slovenia had captured two Soviet sleeper agents. Apparently when the daughters of these agents arrived in Russia, only on the plane did they know that they were actually Russian. They thought they were Spanish. So interesting little element to the whole sleeper agent tale.
Glenn, I saw you reacting when Stephen was talking about how Navalny was supposed to have been involved in this swap originally. It looked like you wanted to jump into the conversation. Please go ahead.
Well, this kind of exchange usually does involve individuals of broadly what is assessed to be equivalent significance, whether it's political, intelligence, or public. So Navalny, as the most prominent individual who was an opposition figure, was really the big deal. And the Russian intelligence officer in Germany was the most significant individual of whom I'm aware at present being held by Western countries. So that his death, mysterious death, complicated, as Stephen said, the entire issue. You always get into it. Always present is the problem of potential moral hazard. If you make a deal, then you encourage further detentions. It's a subjective decision that a political leader has to make. And it goes on all the time. My first assignment 40 years ago was in a quite similar situation, except this was dealing with Hezbollah in Iran, who had kidnapped the head of the CIA office in Lebanon in the early mid-1980s, expressly to pressure and have leverage against the United States. And that's what fundamentally has happened here. So it always cuts both ways. A decision to make a deal, you lose and encourage bad behavior by making the deal, and yet fundamentally a decision to free people who are unjustly held at the cost of allowing the freedom of someone who is, in this instance, assassinating somebody, and others who are intelligence officers. It's always a subjective decision, but the West will incline to trying to free those who are innocent and let those who are guilty go.
Dmitry, you heard Stephen a few moments ago talk about the fact that Vadim Kozikov perhaps was the key man in these very complicated negotiations. Would Russia have agreed to this swap if Germany hadn't released him? Was that the most important element of all this for Russian President Vladimir Putin?
Well, we don't know. It was not publicly stated how important Kozikov was. But obviously, that was an important figure. And I think we need to tell the whole story here, because usually the Western media just mentioned that he killed this former Chechen fighter, as they say, Zelimkhan Khangashvili, a Chechen who was a Georgian citizen. But the whole story is much more complicated. Hangashvili was involved in numerous murders. There was an attack against Nazareth, the capital of a Russian Autonomous Republic of Ingushetia, in 2004, in June 2004, when several hundred policemen were killed. The rebels entered the town. They were dressed as policemen, so they stopped the police cars and just killed anyone who was in any way connected to law enforcement. The policemen, the military, several hundred people were killed. There were unconfirmed informations. There was information that he was involved also in a terrorist attack on Moscow metro. And of course, that was very well confirmed, very well documented. There were videos of him with the terrible terrorist Shamil Basayev. You probably remember the biggest hostage taken in history in 1995. Basayev took several hundred women and children hostage in the town of Budyonovsk in southern Russia. So that man deserved to be in jail. I'm sure about that. But unfortunately, Germany, like many other Western countries, they would not cooperate with Russia. Certainly, they would not cooperate in 2019. So obviously, the decision to liquidate Hangashvili was the only way justice could be done. I'm sorry.
Dmitry.
Some observers here in Moscow compare it to Israel's action in Lebanon. I think
Dmitry, may I just ask you,
softer than what Israel did.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me just ask you this. How is all this being perceived in Russia? What has the reaction been thus far, and what do you think it will continue to be?
Well, the reaction is very positive because people are home. To be frank with you, I'm happy about Ivan Gershkovich. I'm happy about Whelan. I don't know if they were spies or not. I didn't follow the trial very attentively, but I don't think it would make sense for Russia to keep these people in jail and to feed them for 16 years or whatever. The so-called dissidents, Vladimir Karamurza, he didn't want to live in Russia. He feels himself American. He had a green card. He said terrible things about Russia. He called for sanctions against Russia and against individuals. Let him live in the United States. So I think that the general feeling here is one of relief. These children, I have to correct a little bit Stephen Erlanger, they were not Spanish. These two people were Argentinian citizens, and their children felt themselves Argentinian. And yes, Putin said they only learned that they were actually children of Russian parents on their way back to Moscow. Basically, I think that the feeling in Russia is a little bit too optimistic. A lot of observers said that this would signal some kind of improvement of relations between Russia and the West. I don't think that will be the case because the relations between special services are it's a separate story. The biggest swap that took place in 1985 took place before the thaw, before the perestroika and other improvements in relations. So I would not put too much hope in this, but from a human point of view, of course, that's a positive development. These people, they should not be in jail. They should be at their homes with their relatives.
Stephen, I saw you kind of reacting to one of the points that Glyn was making earlier when he was talking about perhaps unintended consequences of these types of deals. And I wanted to sort of drill down on that point with you because critics of Vladimir Putin say that he arrests foreigners in Russia for minor offenses or for concocted charges in order to later on use them for leverage. At the end of the day, is one of the key takeaways from this swap going to be that hostage diplomacy works? What does that mean going forward? Because there are those who say that when deals like this happen, that could encourage more hostage taking by foes of the U.S. and other Western countries.
Well, Mohammed, this isn't the first time this has happened, and Russia isn't the first country to have ever done this. Iran is doing it even as we speak. They did a deal with Belgium recently to get a convicted intelligence agent posing as a diplomat who tried to kill people, dissidents in Paris, was convicted, and he got traded for a Belgian that Iran just grabbed off the street. North Korea has done something similar. And of course, there were big spy trades in the past with the Soviet Union, much as Dmitry says. I remember when Sharansky, who was, I never thought, a spy, but when he was released over the Gleiniki Bridge, I mean, these things have happened in the past. It's an auction, almost like a slave auction. It's a very ugly business, but in general, in the past, it has been spy for spy, or big dissident for a spy. I mean, but Putin has, as he's often done, brought this to a different level. When he traded Brittany Griner, the American basketball star who was caught with some very modest amount of drugs in her suitcase, for Victor Bout, an arms dealer that he'd wanted to get out of jail for a really, really long time. I mean, it's a trade. It's not humane, but it does create more moral hazard. But Joe Biden, I think, was asked about this early this morning, and he simply said, look, my job is to try to get innocent people home, and I do what I need to do.
Glenn, you heard Stephen there talk about Joe Biden saying, I needed to do what needed to be done, basically. From your perspective, was Biden better at pulling this off than other U.S. presidents or other administrations would have been?
I think that's a fair statement, yes. Certainly his supporters have been making this point since the exchange was made public. But I think it is factually correct. In my lifetime, there are two presidents who stand out for their experience in international relations and, frankly, in the functioning of government. And they are the first President Bush and Joe Biden. And there's a lot to be said for experience. You have to have then diligence and intelligence and capability and so on. But President Biden does know the corridors of international power and diplomacy. And I think that was significant in making this possible, yes.
Stephen, let me follow up with you on that point, too, because the White House continues to herald this swap as a feat of diplomacy and a feat of friendship, one that shows the importance of strong alliances. How big of a diplomatic win is this for Biden and his administration? How much skill does it take to pull something like this off?
Well, it was all very delicate, partly because it involved so many countries. And the United States was trying to get back two American citizens, Paul Whelan and Gershkovich, plus others, but who, with very little to trade for them. I mean, the person, as we've said, that Vladimir Putin wanted was in German hands, was in a German jail. So making it work for the Germans and for the Slovenians and for everybody else was a delicate diplomatic dance, particularly once Navalny died. I think it's also true that Putin and Biden have this odd kind of relationship. I think on these issues, there is an element of trust. Biden's not unpredictable the way President Trump has often been, and I think Putin felt he could rely on him. I think there's also one other factor. Olaf Scholz is very close to Biden, and I think he was willing to do this for Biden, and it's not clear to me he would have done it for any other American president.
Dmitry, is there any sense in Russia that this swap might help reset all the antagonism that exists between the U.S. and Russia, or is the feeling that this is simply just a one-time deal?
Well, there are some optimists who say that this could signal an improvement in relations because Russia did not want this brawl with the West that we're having right now. If you look at Putin's biography, at his 3 terms in office, why would he have Olympic Games in 2014? Why would he have the World Cup in Russia in 2018 if he didn't want to have good relations with the West? Of course, the plan of the Russian elite was to integrate with the West and to enjoy the fruits of Western civilization. Unfortunately, the West did not reciprocate. And the realists in Russia say that, no, this is something that we really had during the Cold War. And here I agree with Steve Erlanger, it's an ugly business. But this is just about as much as you can have when you have a Cold War. At least you have pity for individuals, This time it was unequal. It was, we got back 8 people, the West got back 2 times more, 16 people. But I think it's very important that people are with their families and that lives are no longer ruined, because putting a person in jail for 16 years means ruining his or her life. So the mood in Russia is very positive about this. It's like a light in the darkness. It doesn't mean that we are going to have a dawn in the near future, but it shows that in the midst of the conflict that we are having with the West, there are pragmatic forces, there are pragmatic people. There is still some communication between the special services. And all of this made this war possible.
Stephen, I saw you reacting to some of what Dmitry was saying. Did you want to add to the point he was making?
Well, I don't think this is a dawn of a great relationship. I do think it has been very clear since Russia invaded Ukraine in a big way a couple of years ago, now that Russia has turned its back on relations with the West. Now, Dmitry argues it was done the other way around. This is a Russian narrative. I'm not going to argue with it. But the fact of the matter is, I think both sides understand that there's going to be a period of chill. And Russia has defended the war in Ukraine as a defensive war against Western expansion. It has created new relationships with China and Iran. And it seems very uninterested, frankly, in better relations with the West. And this will be true, I think, so long as Vladimir Putin remains the chief of all the Russias. He's the vozhd, he's the boss. And as long as he's the vozhd, I don't think relations are going to improve very much.
Glenn, what do you say on this issue? American officials, of course, have insisted that this swap in no way hints at any détente between Washington and Moscow. What's your take on all this?
I think that's true, but I think I might be slightly more optimistic or naive than Dmitry or perhaps even Stephen on this point, meaning that I don't see we are in a Cold War, and it's have been for years, and tension. This will not improve relations. However, I view this as more likely than not a signal from Moscow. There have been the just nascent indications from Vladimir Putin that he's no longer taking an ultra position on Ukraine, which would mean its destruction and the deaths of the Nazi Jewish leaders and all the other foolishness. As his possibilities become more limited there, and stalemate more likely, you have started to see a peace proposal coming from Moscow for the first time, and the prisoner exchange will not lead to a moment of happiness and entente between the two sides. But I take it as the beginnings of an indication that sometime in the future, Moscow would accept some kind of negotiated solution. Just the very, very beginning. I don't think this would have happened had Moscow not desired to change the current chessboard and dynamic.
Glenn, I also just want to talk for a couple of minutes with you about the complicated logistics of all this. I mean, how difficult was this to pull off? I mean, what sets it apart from other prisoner swaps in the past, and how much had to go right in order for this to happen?
Well, in an intelligence operation, if the secrecy is penetrated, then the operation often will have to be stopped or will go off the rails. In the instance of a prisoner exchange, that is not necessarily as true because making it public, making negotiations public, does not necessarily have to undo the work towards a certain objective. However, it's always better in any negotiation to keep things discreet because individuals like my two colleagues on the interview here will write stories about it and then complicate the work of all parties involved in the negotiation because there are always conflicting objectives and interest groups within the government, outside the government, across governments, and so on. So keeping it secret up until the point of resolution is always better from a government official's perspective. And since you have multiple parties involved in this, the risk of something actually leaking are exponentially higher. But it's always better to be discreet until you can reach an agreement with the party you're negotiating with.
Stephen, we only have about a minute left. From your perspective, did both the U.S. and Russia get what they wanted most out of this swap, or is there the perception that one side walked away with more of what they sought?
No, I think this was a well-negotiated deal. I mean, I don't think the Germans got what they might have wanted with Navalny, but I think for the two big powers, this worked out well. And I'm also hopeful that Glenn is right. I mean, I think the Ukraine war seems to be heading toward a form of stalemate, and there will be negotiations only, I believe, when Vladimir Putin decides he's gotten as much of Ukraine as he's capable of getting. So this may signal a new interest in talks. I hope that's true, and I hope we can bring that killing to an end.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Dmitry Babich, Glenn Carle, and Stephen Erlanger. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.